The Apache girl slept in the snow without fire and taught the rancher how to live through the cold. The wind tore across the plains like a living thing, scattering snowflakes in jagged currents that bit through Clay Henson's coat. His horse staggered beneath him, muscles trembling under the weight of frost, and he pressed his hands to the reins, willing himself forward. The world was white and silent, save for the howl of the storm that seemed to know every regret he carried. Days ago, he had left the ranch to check a distant herd, confident in his stamina, unafraid of the cold he had weathered before. Now, the snow pressed against his face with the certainty of death, and he felt his stubborn pride unraveling in the frozen air. His lips cracked, and the taste of copper rose in his mouth as his horse stumbled over a hidden drift. Clay gritted his teeth and tried to rise, but his legs refused their duty, heavy as wet lead. He felt the snow, the wind stealing the warmth from his chest, his vision fraying at the edges. Memories of his wife long gone surfaced unbidden, her laughter echoing in a house that felt emptier than the plains, her voice a ghost that mocked him for being here, alone, near the edge of death. He closed his eyes, willing himself to survive, but the cold laughed at his resolve. Somewhere in the whiteness, a shadow moved. It was slight at first, slipping over the snow like smoke, but purposeful, deliberate. Tayen, 27, of the Apache people, had tracked a different kind of survival. She moved with the rhythm of the land, attuned to its whispers and hazards. The wind did not frighten her. It carried messages she had learned to read in silence. Her eyes, dark and knowing, fell upon the collapsing figure of the man. He was young enough to live, stubborn enough to die. She made a decision without hesitation. She knelt beside him, her hands bare despite the sting of frost. The first thing she noticed was the color of his lips, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His fingers curled around the reins, knuckles white against the dark leather. She wrapped her own cloak around his shoulders, a heavy buffalo hide that smelled faintly of earth and smoke, pressing him close to her warmth. The snow hissed and drifted around them, but she was a small island of fire against its cold. He tried to pull away, panic flaring, but his strength had already abandoned him. Her hands guided him, steady and patient, as she whispered in her language, words that carried no threat, only the quiet insistence to live. He understood little, yet the tone settled a calm inside him he had not felt in years. In the swirling white, her presence was a tether, anchoring him to life. She lifted him carefully, guiding his faltering limbs toward a shallow rock hollow, a shelter she had known since the first frost. It was no more than a depression in the earth, the walls lined with branches and animal skins, yet it offered the promise of safety. By the fire she coaxed from dry tinder, she pressed his hands to the embers, letting the heat seep into his frozen flesh. Clay shivered, not from the cold alone, but from the intimacy of a stranger's care, her hands lingering with a gentleness that felt almost sacred. She spoke again, slow and deliberate, naming herself Tayen, the new moon. Her eyes held no judgment, only the quiet acknowledgment of struggle, and for the first time, Clay felt the shame of weakness soften under her gaze. He tried to speak, but the words froze in his throat. He was a man who had led men, who had faced storms before, who had buried grief in bottles and silence. Yet here he was, alive only because of another, and it unsettled him more than any blizzard ever could. Tayen did not demand conversation. She moved around him, tending a small fire, mending a moccasin with care, humming a tune that rose above the wind like a thread of warmth. Her presence was steady, a rhythm that reminded him of life's pulse beyond survival. The night deepened, long and endless, and Clay watched her with a mixture of awe and humility. Her strength was quiet, rooted in the soil of experience and hardship, unlike the blunt force of men who had sought to control the land rather than listen to it. She offered him a cup of bone broth, and he drank slowly, feeling the warmth flood more than his body. It seeped into the places in his chest he had thought frozen forever. He watched her hands as they worked, the careful movements of someone who had learned to shape survival into an art. Days passed in this fragile rhythm. Outside, the storm raged or fell silent, leaving the plains cloaked in white, unbroken and indifferent. Inside, firelight danced on their faces, and small gestures became the language they shared. Tayen showed him how to breathe slow, to let the cold pass, without panic. She taught him which snow held life beneath it, which paths promised safety. In return, he shared his stories of the ranch, of cattle and fences, of a wife he could not forget. The words were sparse, hesitant, but they bridged the gap between two souls who had known loss in different forms. One evening, as the wind bent the branches outside and snow piled against their shelter, Clay attempted a fire of his own. Sparks sputtered and died. Tayen smiled softly, leaning close enough for him to feel the heat of her body against his. She placed her hands over his, guiding the spark to life, and together they coaxed flame into a steady glow. He felt a quiet pride, not in his strength, but in the patience she had taught him. The snow pressed against the rock outside, relentless and cold, yet inside, warmth persisted, fragile but real. Their connection was not of passion, not yet, but of understanding. He began to see her not as a savior, but as a companion whose resilience mirrored his own struggle to endure. She was strong, yes, but also tender in ways that reminded him of what he had lost and still hoped to find. And she saw him, truly saw him, not the rancher hardened by grief, but the man capable of learning, of humility, of change. The storm eased at last, leaving the world outside bright and silent, the snow a vast and unbroken canvas. Clay lay beside the fire, wrapped in Tayen's cloak, and for the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to hope. He owed her his life, and with that debt came a reckoning of something deeper, a recognition that survival alone was not enough, that human warmth, shared quietly, could sustain a soul as surely as any fire. He turned his head toward her, seeing the calm in her eyes, and whispered a promise he did not yet fully understand. She answered with a small nod, the corners of her mouth lifting ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgment of what had begun. Outside, the wind softened, and the snow seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the story to unfold further. Inside the rock hollow, warmth lingered, and two lives, once drifting separately through the cold, now brushed against one another, tentative, fragile, yet unbroken. In the quiet, Clay realized that surviving the snow was no longer the measure of life. Learning to live, truly live, guided by the patience and care of another, was the lesson Tayen had come to teach him. And though the journey ahead would be long and uncertain, he felt, for the first time in a lifetime of wandering, that he was not entirely alone. The fire crackled between them, a fragile heart beating in the snow, and the story, like the wind outside, whispered that the next chapter was waiting to be written. The storm had softened to a whisper, but the plains remained white and vast, endless as memory. Clay Henson and Tayen stepped into the quiet, the snow crunching beneath their boots, a rhythm that matched the slow beat of their hearts. Clay felt the weight of her presence beside him, the warmth of her hand tucked in his, and for the first time, the cold seemed less like an enemy than a companion to endure together. The world stretched blank and unbroken, and in that emptiness, every step they took was both a challenge and a revelation. Tayen paused, bending to examine a frozen deer half buried in the drift, her hands tracing the outlines of frost-crusted fur. She murmured softly, a sound more for the wind than for Clay, and he listened, aware of the grace in her movements. Survival had taught her to notice every detail, to read the snow like a living map. He followed her lead, gathering wood and water, watching her instinct guide them through the whiteness. He felt a humility settle over him, a quiet understanding that she had lived through winters far harsher than this, yet she moved without complaint, with a calm that seemed almost sacred. They came upon a broken wagon, half swallowed by the drift, and a lone trapper struggling to lift his frostbitten hands. Clay hesitated, his pride whispering to ride past, but Tayen shook her head. Together they helped the man, sharing the warmth of their fire, rationing what little they had. Clay felt the lesson she had been teaching him for days crystallize in that moment. Strength was not measured in endurance alone, but in the willingness to give of oneself to another. The sun dipped low, a pale gold against the white horizon, when the wind shifted suddenly, biting deeper than before. Tayen faltered, exhaustion etched across her face, her hands trembling despite layers of protection. Clay's heart lurched. He had faced storms before, but never had he felt the helplessness of watching someone he cared for threatened by the cold. He caught her arm, steadying her, and felt the fear he had buried for years surface unbidden. He carried her as best he could, searching the drift for a hollow where they could shelter. At last, he found a small depression in the snow, the walls built by wind and stone into a natural alcove. He forced himself to kneel beside her, wrapping the last of his cloak around her shoulders, pressing his own body against hers to transfer heat. Her breath came in shallow wisps, her eyes half closed, yet she smiled faintly when she felt his warmth. He whispered her name, asking her to stay with him, and she responded with a murmured encouragement, the language of trust that had grown between them over these days. Night fell, and the storm returned in earnest, sheets of snow battering the alcove. Clay worked the fire into life, the smoke curling into the frozen air. He thought of every lesson Tayen had taught him: patience, listening, breathing with the rhythm of life, finding calm in the heart of chaos. He held her hand in his, feeling the pulse of life that had seemed so fragile when he first found her. She squeezed his fingers, and in that gesture, a bond sealed itself more tightly than words could convey. By dawn, the wind had calmed, leaving a fragile stillness across the plains. Clay looked at her and realized that the world had narrowed to this moment, this shared survival. He had lived through snow and storm, but the warmth that mattered most had come not from fire, but from the presence of another human being who had chosen to stay. He knelt beside her, shaping two simple rings from bone he had carried in his coat. They were crude, unadorned, yet perfect in their honesty. Tayen watched him silently, understanding before words could convey it. He took her hands in his, letting the bone circles rest against her fingers, and without ceremony, without witnesses, they joined their lives in the quiet of the snow. Clay's voice was low, almost reverent. He asked her to accept not just his name, but his life, to share the rhythm of survival, the warmth of togetherness, the unspoken promises that had grown between them over days of wind and frost. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling its steady beat, and in that gesture, she agreed. The fire between them crackled, fragile yet defiant against the cold that still pressed around the alcove. The snow glittered in the pale morning light, as if the world itself had paused to honor what had just occurred. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, the hardships of the past seemed distant, their grief transformed into something tender, sacred. They remained there for a time, hand in hand, listening to the silence, the soft sound of snow settling around them. Clay realized that he had not only survived the storm, but had been reborn through it, guided by Tayen's quiet wisdom and unwavering presence. And Tayen, for her part, had found in him a heart that could learn, that could give, that could hold as fiercely as the winter pressed upon them. Eventually, they rose together, stepping into the light of a new day. The snow beneath their feet glimmered, reflecting hope and resilience. Every movement, every glance, every shared breath was a testament to the lessons of the storm: patience, trust, and the transformative power of warmth. Clay held her close, feeling her weight against his chest, and knew that the fire they had kindled together would endure far longer than any fleeting blaze. The plains stretched ahead, untouched and demanding, yet they no longer faced them as separate souls. Side by side, they walked toward the horizon, carrying the promise of life reclaimed from death, love born from struggle, and a future shaped not by pride or fear, but by the quiet strength of shared humanity. The snow crunched beneath them like a heartbeat, steady and unwavering, and in that rhythm, they understood the truth that had carried them through the storm. Some fires do not burn in wood or coal, but in the quiet space between two souls, defying the cold and enduring beyond the winter. And in that silence, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if witnessing a story older than any memory, yet entirely their own. The wind softened, the plains stretched endless, and the two of them, hand in hand, moved forward into life together. If you loved this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more heartwarming Wild West tales.